He said the world are three things, and he calls it the cravings of the sinful nature. The next one is the lust of the eyes, and I'll explain these in a moment. And the third is the pride of life, a boasting of what a man has and does. And so I think when somebody's a true capital T leader, they have the heart of a leader. And those are the type of leaders that I want to follow. Those are the type of leaders that are going to make a difference in our world, the difference in our culture. That's the type of leader I hope we can have one day as the president of the United States. But unfortunately, we haven't had that in a while.
Yeah, and I will just say with a caveat, obviously I'm a conservative, I'm a Christian, but I do not think Trump has been that either. And he's not a great unifier like people on the right like to believe that he should be.
Doesn't connect people. Does he think of others first when he nicknames them and calls them names? That's not thinking of others first.
Right.
Right. When you mess up, is he accepting responsibility when he does make mistakes?
The
No.
you know, and the issue is that it's going to take 15 to 20 candidates that probably don't get the job, but are willing to say, I'm not going to insult the people on this podium. I'm not going to do X, Y, and Z to get the social media trolls to post me. I am going to have respect. I mean, this is what Lincoln wrote about or wrote about in some of his manuscripts. Like he refused to insult his political opponents. He refused to insult even Grant or not Grant. Who was the Confederate general?
Robert E. Lee.
E. Lee. Yeah. He refused to even insult Lee, which is just crazy to think about. This guy is literally on the side of slavery, and Abraham Lincoln is refusing to insult him publicly. And you just think, how far have we come that we get on a bashing campaign for people on our side of the political party? So it doesn't help. And it probably would take about 15 to 20 candidates to the point where the culture starts to change in that direction. So,
Well, it just, I'm sure you're with me. I talked to a lot of people that were just in such amazement that I know so many phenomenal leaders. And if there's 300 million people in this country, it just blows my mind that we can't come up with a better leader to run for the most powerful leader, right, in the United States of America. And I hope one day we'll have somebody that hungers for wisdom, expects the best, accepts responsibility, responds with courage, but thinks of others first,
yeah.
regardless of whether you agree with them or not.
Right. Right. Brandon, you got 10 more minutes or you got to get
I
going?
do. I go 10 more minutes.
There was something you brought up in our first conversation over the phone, and I'd kind of asked you about it, but you said the three P's: struggle, the three struggles: pleasure, possessions, and powers. And I really want to dive into this because I kind of put a fourth P in there. It's more of like a side, but like pornography, I know was a big part of my story, and that goes in obviously into the pleasures side of things, but just specifically, and I think that's kind of what you meant as far as like what you were talking about. But I do want to dive into this a little bit if we have 10 minutes, because that's where I want to take my platform at some point, is fighting that issue specifically.
For sure. So I've had the honor of speaking at multiple churches, and when they do ask me to speak and they say, "Hey, what would you like to talk about?" This is the topic that I like to speak on.
Mhm.
And the reason I'm really passionate about it is that in 2023, this has been going on for a while. We use this term worldview. Like, what's your worldview? And then you end up going, what do you mean? My view of the earth, my view of the planet? Like, no, what the review, your view of human nature and the world and how they see this world, right? Spinning around the sun, like the cultures and the viewpoints and the beliefs that they share. That's what your worldview is. And, if you look at 1 John 2:15 through 17, the Apostle John says, do not love the world or anything in the world.
Right.
And then if your brain's listening to that, you go, what do you mean, John? What's the world? And he ends up defining it.
Right.
He said the world are three things. And he calls it the cravings of the sinful nature. The next one is the lust of the eyes, and I'll explain these in a moment. And the third is the pride of life, a boasting of what a man has and does. So cravings of the sinful nature, the lust of the eyes, and a boasting of what a man has and does. Again, that's lots of words. And so I think to simplify that, I think the cravings of the sinful nature, I'm going to call that pleasure,
Right.
whether that's pornography, because I think that would be a craving of a sinful nature, right? Whether that's pornography, but I also think that can be gluttony. That can be alcoholism. It can be drug addiction, right? You're wanting to feel good, the cravings of your sinful nature. You want pleasure to escape from the world, to escape from struggles you're having, right? You want to feel good. So I'm going to call that pleasure. The next one is the lust of the eyes, which you see something. I think really what John's describing, you see something and you want that thing. So you want to possess. I want that truck. I want that house. I want the mountain home. I want the beach home. I want that job. I want that Olympic gold medal. I want that state title. I want the NCAA title. I want the presidency, whatever it may be. And so I think the lust of the eyes is possessing something. It's possessing things or titles. So that's possessions. And then the boasting of what a man has and does, I would say, or a woman, right, is power. You want power. It's the pride of life. You want to be seen as something, bigger than you are. You want more power. And I think those three things, Christian, are three of the biggest problems on our planet, on the world.
Yeah. You're right.
If somebody has that worldview of like, don't talk to me about pleasure. If it feels good, do it.
Right.
Possessions, I'm going to try to accumulate as many possessions as I want. Power, it's all about, right, who has the biggest title. Like, no, all those are lies. And John goes on to say that if you love the world or anything in the world, he says the love of God's not in you. Then you're not aligned to God if you're loving and chasing after the world. And I think that's a great realization. But then you would love to, like, are there other cross references in the Bible? And I think in God's sovereignty, there are. And I think what's really interesting in Matthew chapter 4, when Jesus had been fasting, not eating in the desert for 40 days, and he comes out, I'm sure that, he was weakened and he was, I would say, probably temptation was going to be more of a struggle for him. And I think that's when Satan tempted him, but he tempted him. It's interesting, Christian, with three things. He hadn't eaten for 40 days. The very first thing he tempted him was bread. Because again, if you haven't eaten, you eat that bread, it's going to make you feel better, right? There's this temptation of pleasure. You haven't eaten, I'm sure that the number one thing you're probably tempted by right now is food.
Right.
So pleasure. And he says, hey, can't you turn that rock into bread? He's tempting him with pleasure. Jesus responds with the verse out of Deuteronomy. He responds with God's word. Satan moves on to the next temptation. He tempts him with possessions. He's like, if you bow down to me, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world. You can possess all the kingdoms of the world. Jesus responds with a verse out of Deuteronomy, right? He responds to God's word. Satan moves on to the last temptation when he tempts him, and he tempts him with power. He's like, don't you have the power if you jump off this cliff to have legions of angels come and save you? Don't you have the power to do that? So it's just interesting to me that John's talking about the world in those three ways. Satan tempts Jesus with pleasure, possessions, and power. And it's also just kind of interesting to me, too, if you go back to the original sin, Adam and Eve in the garden, what did Satan tell her? If you eat that fruit of that tree of knowledge of good and evil, it's going to taste good, pleasure, right? Taste good, right? If you possess it, if you have it, right, it's going to fulfill you. And oh, by the way, when you eat of it, you will know and be like God. You'll have power. So from my perspective, I think Satan, when he tempts us, I think, again, as wrestlers, to use our language, if I'm wrestling, thinking about kind of like having this struggle with Satan, if I understand that he's going to attack me with pleasure, possessions, and power, then I'm better prepared to defend him, my defense. If I'm like, I have no clue, is he going to shoot a single leg, a high cross, a double leg? Is he going to try to throw me? Like, I don't know. But if I know distinctly what his top three moves are, I'm more prepared to defend against that and become more successful, right? And win those daily wrestling matches.
Yeah. especially if you've lost to them 100 times in the past, you start to
Yeah.
build up some data and you start to figure it out. So yeah, well, hey, Brandon, thank you so much, man. I'm going to say it. This was a pleasure, but I think it's fair use of the word. So I don't think it's one of the worldly pleasures. No, this was amazing, and I really appreciate you coming on the show. Very just big. I mean, obviously, I'm a little too young to have been your fan at the time, but I'm a big fan of what you've done. I'm a big fan of the leadership that you've instilled in some of these younger guys that are coming up. And I've watched probably all the guys that you've coached in the last 10 years. My boss is one of your former wrestlers, and nobody leaves your room unscathed, and that's in a good way. So thank you, man, just for being such a great guy, such a great leader, great husband and father. I'm sure you are, and you are somebody that people should aspire to be more like. So thank you, buddy.
Well, thanks, Christian. I'll just close by saying, after that talk on pleasure, possessions, and power, if there's an application, if you say, well, dang, if I'm getting attacked by that, what the heck do I do?
Right.
I think it's important just for me to close by saying that if that's happening, by the way, it happens to all of us.
Right.
Even when you become a Christian, you're not immune to the attacks.
Sure.
I would just say if that's you and you're struggling with that, then you need to do 4 specific things. You need to get into, can't see it, but you need to get in God's word, Bible study. You need to pray, have communication with God, ask him to help you.
Yep.
Ask him to be there with you, ask for his strength, not yours. So Bible study, prayer, worship. And that's not just singing songs. That's a thankful attitude for all you've been blessed with every single day. You can worship in song, but you also can worship just with thankfulness, having a heart of thanksgiving. So worship. And the last one is really important, is to have fellowship.
Yeah.
It's just like you and I today, we're having this fellowship and speaking about truth and encouraging one another. You need to have that with other brothers in your life, sisters in your life, and hold each other accountable of the things you're struggling with. Be honest and candid and transparent and vulnerable with those individuals so they can pray for you, so they can encourage you, because we all struggle in all those 3 things. If you try to succeed on your own without Bible study, prayer, worship, or fellowship, I would say, to follow your hand gesture, you're going to get tanked. You're going to get destroyed. You're going to sink, and your life is not going to be joyous.
Yeah. No, that's what I specifically, when I was saying, porn was part of my past. It was part of my past. That was who I was. I'm no longer that, because I got into a fellowship. I got accountability. I got the blocks on my phones. I've got, people keeping up with what I'm doing, and you cannot do it alone. Again, I'm just going to reiterate what you're saying. If you are struggling with any of these things, you cannot do it alone. There's no possible way. There might be some outliers out there that can will their stuff, but I would fair to say it's not a true addiction. It's just something that you like to do. If it truly is deep to your core and your spirit, you need help. So thank you for saying that. I appreciate that, Brandon.
Doesn't take much to be a Christian. It takes everything.
Yeah.
Takes everything.
Coach Slay, I appreciate you coming on the podcast, man. Thank you so much.
Take care, Christian. Bye-bye.
Yep. Good one.